The hum of the spacecraft's engine faded into the background as Dr. Ethan Hall stared out the viewports, his fingers tapping against the cool metal armrest. Below him, Earth stretched out, a blue marble against the vast, inky expanse of space. It had been 6 years since he'd left, and yet, as the shuttle descended through the atmosphere, he felt an unshakable weight settle in his chest. Coming back to Earth wasn't supposed to feel like this. He'd volunteered for the mission, a high-risk, high-stakes exchange program meant to foster trust between humans and the far-flung alien civilizations who now called the stars their home. There were always rumors of the tensions bubbling beneath the surface, of species that viewed humanity as an experiment, a stepping stone, or worse, a threat to be quelled. And Ethan, like many others, had once been idealistic enough to believe that such exchanges could be the beginning of something greater. But the last few years had taught him how naive that was. He wasn't sure why he'd agreed to return when he'd been asked, especially now that the political climate had shifted, and Earth's standing in the galaxy was more precarious than ever. But here he was, about to meet someone new. Someone who could, quite possibly, change the course of human history. The shuttle's automated voice cut through the silence. Approaching landing zone. Estimated time to touchdown, 2 minutes. Ethan's pulse quickened, his hand instinctively tightening around the armrest. It wasn't fear, no, it was something much deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The shuttle landed with a soft thud, the ground beneath them barely stirring. The door hissed open, releasing a burst of cool, filtered air. Ethan stood, stretching the tension from his shoulders before stepping into the terminal. There was little fanfare, just the quiet bustle of a world on the edge of something new. He glanced at the sleek, futuristic architecture that now defined Earth's central hub, a blend of human ingenuity and alien influences. And then his eyes fell on her. Thelena. She stood by the entrance, her figure slender and graceful, an ethereal contrast to the bustling humans around her. The first thing Ethan noticed were her eyes. Unlike the glittering neon hues of the other alien species, hers were a soft, almost translucent silver, reflective like the surface of a distant moon. They didn't seem to belong to any known species. They were human, in a way. And yet, impossibly alien. Dr. Hall, she greeted him, her voice melodic and smooth, a deep richness to her words that immediately put him on edge. Welcome back. Thelena's presence was captivating, unsettling, even. There was something about her that defied comprehension, like staring at a distant star too long, wondering whether it would ever burn out or pull you in. Ethan couldn't decide whether he was mesmerized or terrified. "You're the student," he asked, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. She nodded. Her long, silvery hair cascaded over her shoulders in a wave of light that caught the artificial glow of the station's overhead lights. "I am. I understand you were curious about my kind. About me." He could feel her studying him, sensing the way his unease shifted the air between them. But he couldn't tell whether it was curiosity or something more calculating, a quiet observation that matched his own. Ethan's curiosity was real, he had been briefed on her species, of course, but there were gaps. And when it came to the TLYSH, those gaps were deadly. "You understand that this is an experiment," he said, his voice firm, but it lacked the confidence he wished it had. "You're not here to study us." Thelena tilted her head, the motion smooth and almost predatory. "Isn't that what we all do? Study each other? Or perhaps we're all just testing boundaries, waiting to see what comes next." There it was again, the tension, an undercurrent that ran deeper than simple academic exchange. It was a game she was playing, and Ethan wasn't sure whether he was the player or the pawn. "I don't understand," Ethan admitted, his brow furrowing. He wanted to trust her, to believe in the notion that Earth and its allies could come together for something greater. But deep down, there was a nagging voice warning him to keep his distance. Thelena took a step closer, the faintest of smiles curling on her lips. "You will. Soon enough." The weight of her gaze pressed into him like a physical force, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world held its breath. He was about to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat as a soft whisper of warning echoed through the hall. Behind them, the shuttle's door closed with a final hiss, sealing them in a space that felt suddenly too small. Ethan's heart skipped. Something was wrong. He turned, scanning the room, but everything appeared normal. The terminal was as bustling as ever, and yet, something in the air felt different. The hum of distant machinery, the chatter of passing civilians, it all seemed too loud, too oppressive now. His eyes flicked back to Thelena. Her smile had faded, replaced by a look of quiet intensity. "It's starting, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan's chest tightened. "What's starting?" Thelena's gaze dropped to the ground, her lips parting as if to speak, but then she froze, a slight tremor running through her. Ethan followed her gaze and, for the first time, noticed the subtle shift in the room. The hum of the engines outside the terminal had taken on a darker tone. The walls, once sleek and confident, now seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible rhythm, as though they were alive. A low rumble sounded from deep within the facility. Thelena's hand brushed against Ethan's arm, a brief, electric touch. "It's already begun," she whispered. And in that moment, everything changed. The terminal buzzed with urgency as Ethan and Thelena stood frozen, their gazes locked, a charged silence hanging between them. The low rumble from deep within the station continued, its pulse resonating through the floor like a warning. Ethan's breath caught, his instincts screaming that something was amiss, but for a moment, he couldn't place it. Thelena's hand had lingered on his arm longer than necessary, the coolness of her touch sending a ripple of heat through him. But it wasn't just the physical contact that unsettled him, it was the weight in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. No, it was something deeper, something far more dangerous. "Thelena, what's going on?" Ethan's voice broke the stillness, his words firm but edged with a growing sense of dread. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow step back, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the terminal, her gaze flicking over the crowd, then over to the shuttle that had just docked. "I told you," she finally murmured, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "It's already begun." Ethan opened his mouth to press further, but the words caught in his throat as the ground trembled beneath their feet. It wasn't just the rumble of machinery now, it was a shift, an overwhelming vibration that seemed to travel through the very structure of the station. He felt it deep in his chest, a thrumming pulse that matched his own racing heartbeat. The terminal's lights flickered once, then twice, before dimming to a low, unsettling glow. The chatter of the crowd died down, people pausing, glancing nervously around. But they weren't looking at each other. They were looking at Thelena. Ethan's gaze snapped back to her, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this a test? Had they expected something like this, some kind of staged emergency to gauge human reactions? But Thelena didn't look like she was acting. She looked nervous. Before he could ask, Thelena turned sharply, her silvery hair whipping around her face as she scanned the room once more. Her eyes narrowed as she spoke in a low, almost inaudible tone, as if she were trying to communicate something without being overheard. "They've found us." "Who?" Ethan asked, his pulse spiking. His gaze swept over the crowd, but there was no one who stood out. No one who looked out of place. But then it hit him. The humans around him weren't the ones to be worried about. "Your government," Thelena said, her words clipped and precise. "And the ones you don't even know about. They've been tracking us for weeks. They know what's coming." Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. His military contacts, the briefing he'd received, it had all seemed so straightforward. But Thelena's cryptic words felt like a sudden slap to his face. Everything he'd been told was a lie. The mission, the exchange, it wasn't about diplomacy or learning from each other. It was about something much darker. "Why are they tracking you?" Ethan's voice was low, a mix of disbelief and fear now creeping into his tone. "What's going on? What's happening?" Thelena's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, her lips barely parted as she seemed to wrestle with an internal struggle. "You don't want to know," she said quietly. "But you will." Ethan's breath quickened as he caught sight of two security officers approaching them, tall, angular, their uniform markings unmistakable. They weren't just any station security, they were military. and their eyes were fixed squarely on Thelena. Thelena, Ethan started, but she cut him off, her hand snapping to his wrist with a grip far stronger than he expected. "Stay close," she hissed. Do not speak unless I tell you to." She tugged him toward the nearest exit, her urgency now palpable in every movement. Ethan followed, his heart hammering in his chest. The officers were too close. He could already see the glint of weapons at their sides, their movements calculated, precise. As they neared the exit, Thelena glanced over her shoulder, her eyes flashing silver with intensity. "They'll be watching. They'll listen to everything." A strange chill ran down Ethan's spine, but before he could respond, the door to the exit slid open with a soft hiss. He was pulled through, the noise of the terminal falling away as they stepped into the quieter corridors of the station. The sharp scent of sterilized metal filled the air, the sterile, artificial atmosphere making his pulse throb in his throat. Thelena led him down a narrow hall, each step echoing in the otherwise silent space. It felt as though the entire station was holding its breath. Finally, they came to a stop in front of a door at the end of the hall. It wasn't marked, no numbers, no names. Just a door. Thelena stood there for a moment, her hand hovering over the control pad. "I need you to trust me," she said, her voice hoarse, betraying her calm demeanor. "What's about to happen will change everything you know about Earth's place in this galaxy." Ethan didn't speak. There were too many questions swirling in his head, too many things that didn't make sense. But something in the way she said those words, the quiet desperation in her eyes, stopped him from voicing them. Thelena tapped in a series of commands on the pad, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. She stepped inside, her silver eyes flicking back to Ethan, urging him to follow. He hesitated, a deep unease settling in his chest. For a moment, the door hung open, the interior of the room dark, as if it were waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. Then, without warning, the soft buzz of a communication signal filled the air, and Ethan's gut tightened as the door began to close behind him. The message, broadcast in a low, almost imperceptible tone, was clear. "They're coming." Thelena's voice whispered from the shadows, her eyes flashing with an intensity that bordered on fear. "It's too late to go back now, Ethan. We're already part of their plan." And just like that, the world as Ethan knew it began to crumble. Ethan's pulse thrummed in his temples, his hand pressed to the cold, smooth wall of the darkened room as he followed Thelena inside. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing them both into the quiet. The low hum of the station's infrastructure had faded into a strange, almost unnerving silence. The room was small, no more than a storage closet repurposed for something far more ominous. The only light came from a single panel overhead, casting sharp shadows across Thelena's face. Her silver eyes shimmered in the faint glow, but there was a darkness there now, a glimmer of something primal. She had been calm before, too calm for someone caught in a game she could barely control, but now, the layers of composure were beginning to crack. Ethan wanted to ask 100 questions, demand answers, but the words were lodged in his throat. What had she meant by a part of their plan? Who was coming? And why, for God's sake, had she dragged him into this? "Thelena," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turbulence inside. "I need you to explain what's going on. Why are we here?" "What's?" But she held up a hand, her expression stern, focused. "No more questions, Ethan," she interrupted, her voice almost a whisper. "We don't have time." Her eyes flicked toward the far corner of the room, and Ethan instinctively followed her gaze, but saw nothing. The silence grew thicker, more oppressive, like the space around them was closing in. "What do you mean, we don't have time?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "Who's coming? What's going to happen?" Thelena looked back at him, her gaze intense, but there was something softer now in her eyes, an apology, perhaps. "I told you this wasn't going to be easy," she said quietly. "But the truth is, they've found us." Her words seemed to hang in the air between them, as though the very space were charged with electricity. She exhaled sharply, pressing her hand to her forehead, as if trying to stave off some overwhelming thought or feeling. Ethan's heart picked up its pace. She was shaken. Genuinely shaken. What do you mean by they've found us? Ethan asked, his voice sharp with urgency. You've been lying to me, haven't you? This is about more than just a mission. You're hiding something from me. From all of us. Helena's eyes flicked to the corner again. Ethan's gaze followed hers, but he saw nothing. She gave a quick shake of her head, biting her lip before turning her full attention back to him. I never lied to you, Ethan. I simply couldn't tell you the whole truth. And now, she paused, closing her eyes as if gathering her thoughts. Now it's too late to go back. Ethan's confusion deepened. He reached out, grasping her shoulder, trying to steady the tremor he saw running through her. What are you talking about? His voice was low, almost desperate. Tell me, Helena. I need to understand. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, the silver hue seemed to glow brighter, like the reflection of a distant storm. She swallowed hard, her throat working as if the words she needed to say were lodged just beyond her reach. I told you, the TLYSH are not here by accident. The Earth government has been tracking us since our arrival, Ethan. But what you don't know is, there are others who've been watching, too. She took a sharp breath, the tension in her jaw palpable. More powerful. More dangerous. A cold wave of realization hit Ethan. The Zaloth, he whispered. His mind immediately flashed to the briefing reports he'd read months ago. The Zaloth were the most feared faction in the galaxy, an empire known for conquering planets and eliminating threats with ruthless precision. Helena nodded, her expression grave. Yes. The Zaloth have been hunting us. They believe we've crossed a line, made ourselves too visible. And they will stop at nothing to destroy us. Her words settled in the room like an anchor. Ethan could feel the weight of them, the danger, the stakes suddenly higher than he'd ever anticipated. His stomach twisted as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Helena, the TLYSH, she wasn't here to teach humans about alien cultures. She was running, hiding from an enemy that had already set its sights on her people. And by extension, on Earth. Then why are you still here, he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. Why stay, knowing they're coming? Helena's gaze hardened, but there was still that flicker of something, vulnerability? Regret? Because the TLYSH need Earth. We've reached a point in our evolution where we can no longer survive alone. We need your help. Your human help. Her voice dropped lower, almost reverent. But we also need the one thing your people have that we don't. Ethan blinked, his mind racing. What is that? Hope. The room seemed to contract around him, and for the briefest of moments, everything went silent. It was as though Helena's words had pulled all the air from the space, leaving only her and Ethan suspended in the void. I don't understand, Ethan muttered, shaking his head. His heart was thudding now, louder than the pulse in his temples. How does hope help against the Zaloth? Helena's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. You humans are unpredictable, she said, her voice steady but raw. You've overcome everything the universe has thrown at you. You fight when all seems lost. You survive. Ethan stared at her, the implications of her words settling over him like a cold shadow. She was asking him to believe in the impossible. To trust in human strength in the face of an empire that had crushed civilizations far older than Earth's. But before he could respond, the distant sound of clanging metal reached his ears, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a door opening somewhere beyond the room. Helena froze, her expression shifting from one of deep, exhausted resignation to something darker, more urgent. They're here, she whispered. Ethan's eyes widened as the reality of the situation hit him. This was no longer a game. They were under threat, and the Zaloth were coming for them, no, for her. And if he didn't act quickly, everything they knew would be torn apart. The moment stretched infinitely between them as they stood in the dark room, listening to the approaching footsteps. And then, without another word, Helena moved toward the only exit, her body tense with purpose. Ethan followed her without hesitation. This was just the beginning. The station's emergency lights flickered, casting an unsettling red hue over the sterile, metallic hallways. Ethan's boots echoed against the floor as he followed Thelena deeper into the labyrinth of corridors, his every step weighed down by the gravity of her words. "They're coming for us." The Zaloth. Thelena's strides were quick, purposeful, her sharp profile cutting through the dimness ahead of him. Ethan's pulse thrummed in his neck, but he forced himself to remain focused. The air was heavy with something beyond the mechanical hum of the station, something anxious, like the whole place held its breath, waiting. "We don't have much time," Thelena said, her voice tight but steady. She glanced back at him briefly, her silver eyes filled with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "The Zaloth aren't just a threat to the TLYSH. They'll burn everything to the ground to get what they want. And right now, they want me." Ethan's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to speak. "What do they want with you? Why aren't you fighting back?" She didn't answer immediately, her jaw tightening in frustration. The hint of vulnerability he'd seen before was gone now, replaced by something colder, something distant. But her shoulders were tense, her body wound tight with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the kind of quiet rage one could only feel when they'd lost everything and were about to lose more. "Because it's not just about me," Thelena said finally, her voice low but unwavering. "It's about all of us. And if I'm captured, Earth won't stand a chance." Ethan blinked, his thoughts scrambling. "What do you mean? Earth? You're telling me this goes beyond just you and the TLYSH?" Thelena paused, turning to face him fully. The corridor seemed to stretch out behind her, as though the world itself had slowed to give her words the weight they deserved. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but resonant with a truth Ethan wasn't prepared to hear. "The Zaloth will make Earth their new front, Ethan. And if they succeed, it will be the end of everything." For a moment, everything around them was silent. Ethan's mind raced, images of Earth, the streets he'd walked, the people he'd known, flashing before him. The magnitude of her words settled into his chest like a stone. He stepped closer, his voice tight with disbelief. "Why are you telling me all this now? You said you needed my help, but this is too much. How am I supposed to fight the Zaloth?" Her eyes softened then, a flicker of something human breaking through the mask of command she'd worn since the moment they met. "Because you have something they don't, Ethan. Hope. I've seen it in you. In your kind." Ethan stared at her, trying to understand. "You're telling me the TLYSH need humans to fight a galactic empire?" "Yes," she said firmly. "It's always been that way. You don't understand the kind of strength you possess. Your unpredictability. The way you fight for the impossible." She took a step closer to him, her voice almost a whisper now, her breath quickening with the urgency of her words. "It's why I came here. It's why I needed you to trust me." Ethan felt a rush of emotions, confusion, fear, and an undeniable pull toward the alien standing before him. But beneath it all, something raw and instinctive stirred. She needed him. Not just for the TLYSH, not just for herself, but for something larger, something he couldn't yet fully grasp. "I don't know how to fight them," he said, his voice rough with frustration. "But I can't just walk away either. Not when Earth's on the line." Thelena's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the distance between them seemed to narrow. But before she could respond, a loud crash echoed down the hall behind them. Ethan spun, his instincts kicking in. He had only seconds before whatever was coming would arrive. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. "They're here." Thelena's voice was a low growl, and her face tightened with urgency. "Get to the control room. I'll hold them off." "No," Ethan said, grabbing her wrist as she started to move toward the corridor. "We do this together. I'm not letting you face them alone." Thelena paused, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. "This isn't your fight," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It is now," he replied firmly. His grip tightened, and in that moment, he felt a rush of something he hadn't expected, purpose. The weight of what they were about to face was clear, but there was no turning back now. A faint sound of footsteps reverberated down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Thelena met his gaze again, her expression torn. She wanted to argue. She wanted to protect him. But Ethan had already made up his mind. With a sharp nod, she released a breath and turned back toward the corridor. "Stay close," she murmured. "We're about to find out if humanity's strength is enough to save us." The two of them moved in sync now, feet pounding the metal floor as they sprinted down the hallway toward the control room. The door to the room loomed ahead like a final barrier, their salvation, and a place where the last stand would unfold. Ethan's heart raced, but there was no fear in him now, only a fierce determination. He didn't know what came next, didn't know if he'd live to see Earth's sky again, but one thing was certain, this was where his story, and Thelena's, would be written. And if they were going down, they were going to do it together. The door to the control room slid open, and they both stepped inside. The Zaloth were waiting.